clip that we will do for new materialist articulations. First, we will be returning to the second part of a lecture that we did at ETH Zurich in March 2020. The broader theme of this lecture was urbanism beyond technofix. The first part of our talk there consisted of reflections on Suzanne K. Langer's index card mobile architectures. The second part introduced the creative humanities as a field of scholarly engagement, which places concepts center stage. In the second part, we ask, what can concepts do? And we will play this part for you now.
Let's continue with the creative force of concepts. As Iris has shown, concepts exist in a dynamic relationality with objects. Concepts do not represent individual objects because the objects come into being as a specific set with their conceptualization. The mobile architecture that Suzanne Langer and Ernst Cassirer refer to was situated differently compared to the mobile architectures I've been interested in as a media theorist. Importantly, however, notions of fixing and unfixing, that is, of thinking architecture in and for mobility, were quite similar. From our collaboration in the following, we want to sketch a conceptual and what we call a creative humanities approach for the question of un-techno-fixing architecture. The creative humanities is the meeting point of philosophy and theory of the humanities on the one hand, and on the other, design disciplines and creative practices in the broadest sense. Today, this meeting is embodied by us as humanities scholars and by you as architecture students. And from this perspective, we want to sketch some specific critical concepts for the creative humanities that we see as maybe relevant for taking up the question central to this series of talks about architecture beyond technofix. By succinctly introducing these specific concepts, but perhaps more importantly, also sketching the performative potential of concepts in the broadest sense, we hope to start a conversation with you, not only how these concepts can be relevant to mobile architecture, or to thinking mobile architectures, or the general question of thinking beyond technofix, but also about how concepts play a role on both ends of our disciplinary spectrum: philosophy, media theory, and architecture. As simultaneously discursive and material, that is, as agentially cutting out objects, concepts are unique material with which research is being done. This research is intrinsically dynamic, as concepts are never merely applied onto objects. Rather, research with concepts is done in such a way that not only do we learn something about an object, but also and simultaneously do we sharpen our theoretical toolbox. Critical concepts for the creative humanities, and here the meeting of philosophy, theory, and architecture, are always performative and methodological. As such, they are productive and experimental doings, enmeshed in practice, rather than fixed retrospective labels for things that seemingly exist before and outside of research, artistic design, or curatorial processes. They guide the user to where and when one starts or has started her research, and to the encounter with and in which both researcher and researched come into being. The concepts are inherently experimental, and they open up to yet unknown territories of thought. The creative in creative humanities can be recognized in a literally productive connection between making practice and thinking practice. Making as and through thinking, and thinking as and through making. Creativity is hence a fundamentally methodological quality. The methodologicity involved is emphatically experimental and comfortable with knowledge production in uncertainty, multiplicity, and friction. Thinking with, through, and beyond concepts, creative humanities projects are creative in designing and developing their own methods and approaches, as they seek to navigate and explore the productive connections and reciprocal relationships between the creative practices they engage with, and to develop conceptual analytical approaches for what these practices also work with, through or beyond. Through their engagement with contemporary artistic, cultural, and societal issues, as themselves fully immersed in 21st century media and the algorithmic condition, the experimental, scholarly, and creative projects develop conceptual foci whilst also at the same time designing for debate. The concept-driven design thinking in the creative humanities is already fundamentally and programmatically a critical creative practice. This implies first that a creative humanities practice can be recognized as scholarship as it has already been conducted in the past, following a rereading or rewriting. The conceptual practice can, after the fact, in real time and or speculatively be inserted into humanities scholarship. Second, connections with creative making practices are recognized and explored, but not by way of constructing a paradigmatic transfer from making to researching. Creative humanities scholarship establishes itself inherently and critically as a processual, concept-generating endeavor. In the coming months, Iris and I will be working on the book project Critical Concepts for the Creative Humanities, a glossary or dictionary of sorts that will be published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it comprises a collection of concepts that are provisionally defined, positioned, and demonstrated and referenced in each lemma of the collection. These are new or revisited concepts that are fruitful for and come out of current philosophical and creative practice. The concepts collected in our glossary range from accident to zetesis, include kinning and unkinning, and we also revisit concepts like assemblage, diffraction, and dispositif. The glossary entails the canonization of the work of a younger generation of scholars, a generation that witnessed both the arrival of the creative humanities and constituted its bibliography and praxis. The book establishes the creative humanities with the research-driven output of creative practitioners, designers, cultural curators, and policymakers, work that establishes an emergent canon of avant-garde thinking and the new reading list of scholarship for the next generation of cultural participants or the makers, performance, and audiences of our contemporary arts and culture. At the same time, we aim to provide the contours for the canonization of the new generation of scholars, a generation that we are already part of.
So, part 3, concepts. To introduce the format, let us start with the very last concept in the book that paradoxically provides, perhaps, a starting point for productive meetings of thought, such as today. Zetesis, zetetic. Zetesis means search, examination, or inquiry in ancient Greek, and has an adjective in English, zetetic, meaning proceeding by inquiry. In Socratic and Platonic philosophy, this form of inquiry departs from an inquisitive and critical attitude and from one's own experience of oneself. Often understood as a skeptic attitude of fundamental doubt, in more recent rereading, zetesis has also gotten a more optimistic interpretation of a permanent or iterative questioning. This philosophical etymology
etymology of synthesis harbors a congruity between theory and art, that is, the respective roles of curiosity, experimentation, and risk involved in various forms of philosophical and creative inquiry. Therefore, as an analytical concept, synthesis activates a perspective on these traits that are shared by artistic as well as scholarly practices and raises questions about how these practices shape and take shape in specific projects. The concept emphasizes, firstly, a fundamental subjectivity and self-reflexivity involved in both modes of inquiry. Secondly, it refers to this subjectivity as a preliminary starting point for creative research. Thirdly, it raises questions about the open and processual nature of the subsequent research and/or creation as it unfolds with experimentation and hence risky practice. The critical potential of the concept lies in how it raises analytical and evaluative questions about the openness of scholarly and/or creative projects and their transparency about the multiplicity and mobility of their lines, movements, and segues of question and thought, including the role of risk in the process of their emergence, directions, and redirections. Moreover, the synthesis of any kind of research points at its originary starting point. For example, curiosity, or that what produces inquiry, and how this becomes a starting point for debate, invention, and a productive invocation of the imaginary. Such a starting point can indeed be recognized as inspiration for Synthesis, the International Journal for Fine Art, Philosophy, and the Wild Sciences, with its motto of Research by Curiosity. The journal, with executive editor Johnny Golding, professor of philosophy and fine art at the Royal College of Art London, is hosted by the Centre for Fine Art Research and the Research Centre for Creative Making at the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media of Birmingham University. It explores theoretical, philosophical, creative, and political intersections in fine art and scholarship. The concept as name here puts on the agenda the urgency for adopting an intra- and transdisciplinary perspective that is fueled by curiosity and a fascination for the unknown. The second concept that we want to highlight today addresses the problem of fixation. Classification. A logic of classifying objects and classifying living or dead organisms underlies the sciences on the one hand, and on the other, institutionalized and activist forms of social relating. The life sciences, for example, divide up the living organisms they study according to a taxonomy. Another example pertains to the social sciences that study kinship structures, anthropology, or other forms of identification and social organization. The humanities classify artifacts of human making according to their form, theater, painting, etc., and individual artworks according to their style or movement, Impressionism, Dadaism, etc. Similarly, institutions and the social movements reacting to them use classification according to categories such as gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity in order to gather the people they wish to represent or to specify the causes they work for. Classification becomes classifixation once the division of people, other organisms, and things in the classes that they seem to belong to, as if by nature, is naturalized, thus erasing diversity and mutability. Contemporary research and creative art practices respond critically and creatively to classifixations on the basis of the recognition that the idiosyncrasies and transformations of individual persons, organisms, and things cannot be captured and are fixated by most classifications. This is because classifications are based on generalizations and have certain other characteristics. Linnaean biological taxonomies are hierarchically structured. There is man and there are lower animals. Classifications of movements in thought are often structured by a sequential negation, whereby Y is said to be more effective, or simply better scholarship, than X and Z than Y. Hierarchical structures and sequential negations make the narratives they create progressive. However, progress narrative, just like generalization, does not sit comfortably with idiosyncrasy and non-teleological transformation. Contemporary scientific research, informed by nonlinear biology and quantum mechanics, but also the humanities after post-structuralism with their canon and genre-critical approaches, have acknowledged the reductionism of classification. It is also in the realm of art practices that alternative categorical logics are explicitly experimented with. Dutch photographer Arie Versluys and Dutch stylist Ellie Uitenbroek first published their project, Exactitudes, in book form in 2002. Since 1994, they have approached individual members of perceived subcultures encountered on the streets of Rotterdam in order to photograph them in a studio setting, wearing exactly what they wore upon first meeting them. Their project alludes to a scientific vision working towards classification of humans and is brought together with an interest in the sociological study of generalized groups and types, and with the humanistic study of codes, here dress codes, and idiosyncratic exceptions to the norm. With their project, Versluys and Uitenbroek demonstrate that classifications never quite work and are, their stifling structures notwithstanding, self-deconstructing arrangements.
Our third concept, the last, we promise, perhaps suggests a way out of thinking in fixations. Cartography and performative cartography. Cartography is the practice of creating representations of spatial territories, whether geographical or synthetic, that is digital, architectural, or in other ways created, or theoretical. While cartography is also often used to designate the results of this practice, the cartographies created, the distinction between the process and its result is significant. Creating cartographies is never neutral. It inherently infuses its territories with perspectives, logics, and principles of in and exclusion. Think, for example, of an author or a maker who has fallen off the canon of hierarchically structured anthologies and curricula, or alternatively, of horizontal and open cartographies of thought and practice across scholarship and art. Cartography as a practice is always already a cultural, discursive, and theoretical endeavor as it constructs spatio-temporal relationality and possible future navigation. The navigation on my screen went wrong. Sorry. That's so ironic. Cartography as a practice is always already a cultural, discursive, and theoretical endeavor as it constructs spatio-temporal relationality and possible future navigation through the territories constructed and mapped. When conflating the practice of cartography and its results in cartographies, this process of construction and its implications may become obfuscated. In response to digital, interactive, locative technologies, mobile media, and algorithmic media, the concept of performative cartography emphasizes a shift from object to action. It postulates the need to understand cartography as an activity, as a form of navigation that emerges in mobility, change, and difference, rather than resulting from fixation and delineation, as in traditional representational mapmaking. Understanding cartography as a dual practice, whereby the immanent doing of cartography is a productive integration of space, time, and thought, immediately points at performativity rather than representation. Representational maps are informed by modern epistemologies that not only allow for progressive knowledge production and work according to a Cartesian dualistic logic. Following this logic, a certain territory or phenomenon can be mapped, resulting in a map. Pre-representational or performative maps, on the other hand, foreground process, mutability, flux, simulation, remediation, notions of becoming and mobility. That is, the processes before representation in which representations come into being. Performative cartography foregrounds the processual, procedural, and deictic experience of this navigation as more fluid than fixed spatiotemporal positioning. Performative cartography emerges in movement as a particular form of creative navigation, with its maps and its views evolving and emerging along the way. This coupling of time and space after the performative turn encourages a qualitative shift away from modern dualism so that we come to understand the map as a spatial and temporal event. Performative cartography, then, is a cartographizing of multidirectionality, which embodies change, difference, and to some degree, unpredictability and bisque. You have now heard about three concepts: zetesis, classification, performative cartography. And together these concepts were introduced in our lecture as to unfix and engagement with urbanism. And in the lecture we did so implicitly. We implicitly mobilized these three concepts together as a constellation. But what would be an explicit mobilization? For that we need to establish their common ground, or the terrain between them, from which a critical and creative engagement with urbanism can be productively launched off. Such a common ground is never fully fixed. As a ground or terrain, it needs working, it needs to be mobilized, to become situated and activated, to generate analytical, critical, and creative engagement with or in the topic at hand. So we want to move on, therefore, by providing you with three ways of establishing such a terrain as launching pad, by introducing you to three specific methods: speed reading, connective reading, and effective reading.
First, speed reading. And speed reading is something that I also encountered on one of Suzanne Langer's index cards that I studied at Harvard University. Speed reading. I wonder in what way speed reading would influence scholarly thinking. It might change the pattern from intercalated thought to retrospectively analytic thought, with a gain in synoptic orientation of ideas within the whole, even as they occur. We don't know exactly when Suzanne Langer wrote this card. I think she wrote this card in the 1950s, 1960s, maybe the 1970s even. And I find it a very interesting and very affirmative take on what you would, at the first instance, think of rather critically as a form of reading that produces a loss because you're rushing through a text instead of reading it, studying it carefully. But what Suzanne Langer says on this card is that usually we read in such a way that we read a text in order to kind of slot it into the categories of thinking, canonic categories, for example, isms that we already know. And she says that when reading very speedily, we don't read for, let's say, signs that help us to kind of insert a text into a previously existing system or systematization of thought, but we read in a way with the unfolding of the larger idea or the larger argument of the text. And while kind of working our way through a text in a very speedy way, we not only kind of get an idea, a synoptic idea of what the text wants to bring forward, but the smaller ideas that form themselves, or maybe even, this larger idea that forms itself throughout the text, moves to the forefront of what you are reading for. So you're not reading for a kind of slotting of this text into something pre-existing, but you're really reading for what the text presents as something original. And there is a gain not only in synoptic orientation, so larger kind of idea that the text brings forward, but there is also the possibility to then retrospectively, while once this broader idea has formed itself, to retrospectively start to kind of analyze with what the text brings forward, and then with that the text in itself also becomes analytic. So this is the first kind of way of reading for a common ground, perhaps, but not a common ground in this case that is established by working a text into what is presented in the history of thought in a very systematic and linear presentation of thought. A second method that I want to talk about is connective reading, and I want to also explain how speed reading is a form of connective reading. And this idea of connective reading and also actually connective writing comes from a book, The New Humanities Reader, that I warmly recommend. And in the introduction to the New Humanities Reader, the editors, Richard Miller and Kurt Spellmeyer, argue that all knowing is a process of connecting. And they zoom in on knowing with texts. And they argue that certain texts in particular ask the reader to become an active co-creator with the writer. And we've already heard with Suzanne Langer that you can also, as a reader, actively position yourself as such a co-creator. But there are also texts that actually ask this explicitly from the reader. So these are usually open texts, texts that ask a lot of questions, with which, of course, analyses, critical and creative, can be made. And Miller and Spellmeyer argue about these texts that kind of ask a co-creative positioning from the reader. They say readers need to see themselves as involved in a kind of dialogue, moving back and forth from textual details to a sense of the larger whole. And of course, what you've seen in the speed reading quotation from Suzanne Langer is that there is also a moving back and forth from details to a sense of the larger whole, whereby the coming into being of this larger whole within the reader is the originary orientation. The New Humanities reader is really a methodical text, and Miller and Spellmeyer actually spell out how such a kind of zooming in and out might work, and how you can actually actively how do you say that, you can actively also stimulate it in students, for example. And they argue that this way of reading for connection starts with a prospective view, a guess at the argument that might lie ahead. So they say you're confronted with a text and you start guessing, what may this text be about? What may be the proposal or the proposition of this text? And then they argue that a second step is retrospective, because when you have grasped this synoptic whole in a way, you can also move back and also look at textual elements. Meaning, Miller and Spellmeyer say, is a product of interpretation, and interpretation demands from us the search for a retrospective view. And of course, you can only start engaging with a text retrospectively once you have actually grasped something as the very basic idea proposed by that text. And of course here the idea of a very basic idea is actually a very rich and mobile idea. Then they make this retrospective reading even more specific, and they can say that you can actually transpose this move, not only you can transpose this also to other texts. So of course, you know, you can first prospectively read for the proposal of a text, and then zoom in and actually work with that proposal in order to actually analyze and interpret textual elements. But you can also use that larger a proposal of a text in order to actually work with other texts. Instead of starting with one part of a text and using it as a window to review the rest, we can use it as a window to begin a retrospective reading of another writer's work. And here you see that actually Miller and Spellmeyer are also talking about picking out a specific textual element that you can use to then work through another writer's work retrospectively in order to kind of enrich or even understand that writer's work. And what the creative humanities is all about is that thinking, making, acting, all of these projects are characterized by this prospective, retrospective dynamic, which, you know, the minute you start to talk also about making or about acting, you immediately see that the transposition that I mentioned earlier should not be confined to a textual kind of realm, but also deals with objects and the world itself. And here I want to refer to diffractive reading as a form of speed reading and as a form of connective reading. Diffractive reading is a reading of texts, objects, and the world as processes of entering new ideas. So, and I wrote about this in short text, Signals Falling, reading Virginia Woolf and Felix Guattari diffractively for a new materialist epistemology. And this is a very short text that was published in 2017 in the Minnesota Review, which is a journal of creative and critical writing. And here I talk about the fact that a detail, a textual detail, but it can also be a physical detail, can engender a process of entering new ideas. So you can actually use and follow a textual or a physical detail, a leaf, for example, or a relation that you see unfolding in front of you, or a relation in which you find yourself. You can use this encounter with an object, a relation, or an encounter as a process of entering a new idea that you can then use to retrospectively read or interpret other objects, other relations, other encounters, or simply texts. And these new ideas, the newness, is important. This is newness, and newness is important. Newness has a certain force. Newness has a liberating force. Newness can also have a confining force, in which somebody, a thinking subject, a making subject, an acting subject, suddenly finds herself to be confined. These two sides of newness, the newly, suddenly, and seldomly coming up of ideas that can then be used retrospectively. This newness is something that both Virginia Woolf and Felix Guattari wrote about, and that I then developed further diffractively. So I wrote, it is very well possible either that, albeit suddenly and seldomly, an external token of a prostituted culture is incorporated in the mind, or that a captivated intellect is liberated by an impression of a different kind. So a new idea may liberate someone who is encapsulated in Woolf's prostituted culture, which is basically a patriarchal system of thought, a patriarchal system of relations, a system in which encounters are often, more often than not, overcoded by patriarchy. So this new idea can either liberate one from such a prostituted patriarchal culture, or can suck one into such a culture when one is actually enjoying an open and more free life of the mind. So this new idea that one then can pick up for retrospective analytical thought, this idea may come out as harmful for humans, non-humans, or the non-human in us, but it may also come out as liberating, as freeing. To close, the question would then be, how would you connect synthesis, classification, and performative cartography? How would you use these methods of speed reading, of connective reading, and of diffractive reading, which is also a form of reading texts, or texts and objects, or texts and happenings in the world through one another. So how would you use these in order to find a dynamic common ground? And if you would do that for the articulation of what?